Greetings everyone. So in today's video we will hear arguments brought forward by leader of the opposition Mark Golding in response to the government proposed amendment to the law which speaks to the minimum mandatory sentence for children who are found guilty of murder. Basically, the government is proposing that a mandatory minimum of 50 years be extended to children under the age of 18 who are found guilty of murder. According to Mark Golding, this is excessive. So basically, again, he's saying that irrespective of the reason or the circumstances, persons or children who are found guilty of murder under the age of 18 should not receive 50 years, a minimum of 50 years for that crime. Let's hear what he has to say. Please, as always, share your thoughts in the comment section below.
We'll invite the opposition to make its contribution in respect of the Criminal Justice Administration Amendment Act 2023 and the Offences Against the Person Amendment Act 2023 and the Child Care and Protection Amendment Act 2023. The member from St. Andrew South Eastern will be first to present.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't see the minister. Oh, he's coming in. You're well refreshed from downstairs. Madam Speaker, I stand in opposition to what has been proposed in this law, and I'm going to outline the reasons. First, there's no evidence that has been provided that judges have been applying what I call the light touch in sentences to persons who have been convicted of serious crimes, and murder in particular. Second, there is no evidence that harsher sentences are a deterrent to criminal activity. None. Third, evidence. Third, I would say the mischief that is trying to be resolved by this legislation exists, where if you believe that a sentence is insufficient for the crime committed, the prosecution has the right to appeal that sentence. And the prosecution can. And the prosecution has appealed sentences and have gotten longer sentences. But, Madam Speaker, this legislation is bad on a number of grounds, apart from those. It does not address the critical reason why we have violent crimes. I believe what we are trying to do is to give the impression that we are tough on crime without dealing with the causes of crime. And in particular, for those persons who are 18 and under who commit violent crimes. And there are a myriad of reasons. I have never been someone in support of removing judicial discretion by minimum mandatory sentences. But I think it is even more important to retain it when you are dealing with persons who commit crimes as children, under 18, because the circumstances which give rise to those criminal activities are very different from adults. And there are a plethora of reasons. We know that we have an education system that turns out children at 15 and 16 who are barely literate or numerate. And that impacts our crime rate because they become recruits for gangs. We know how poor socialization impacts young people. We know how the inability to determine whether there are behavioral challenges at a young age. So whether young boys have ADHD or other things, they can't do assessments, they can't be treated. Those are the things that are impacting crime at a young age. What the minister is going to do with these minimum mandatories is to clog up the court system, because nobody is going to resort to wanting to settle before they go to a trial. There will be no pleas. So you're going to create a backlog in the court system, which means that people who commit other crimes going to have to wait years and years before their court cases can be heard. And then also, you're going to clog up your jails. And your prisons, sorry. This does not address the root cause of the problem. I'm going to urge the minister and those on that side. You have the majority, so you can pass it. But don't pass more bad legislation. It is not dealing with the critical issues in the country. Let us get tough on the causes of this crime. We don't have any coordinated social intervention program in the country. Foolishness. You have outsourced it to Project Star. You tell me you have rolled it up into ministries. Tell me who I can call when I have a problem in my constituency. There is nobody. None. There is nobody. Implement it. Don't tell me. Implement a comprehensive social intervention program across the board so that those youngsters who fall out of the system have a second chance. Yes, you have heart, but you need beyond that. I am saying let us focus the energies not in legislation to increase minimum mandatories, particularly for youngsters 18 and under. Under 18. But deal with what gives rise to the criminal activity. Jamaica have a violent problem. We have a high crime rate. This is not going to solve it in any way, shape, or form. It is going to backlog our criminal justice system. It is going to put more people in jail. You're going to reduce the possibility for rehabilitation. And I'm really focused on those 18 and under. It's different for adults. But there are many issues that give rise to 18 and unders committing crime. This will do nothing to solve the problem. And in the same way, we passed the Ombudsman Act to incorporate it into EOJ, and it's been an absolute failure. Nothing happened in the local government election. Absolute failure. Let us not go again and pass bad legislation, which will have a negative impact and not deal with the root cause of the problem. This does not address the root cause of the problem.
Think Minister Chok will respond to the issue of the need and the quality of legislation being passed, but the member have made some comments I have to respond to. The question of dealing with the root cause of crime is an issue that this government has taken very seriously and has done more than any other government in the past. Absolutely any other government. The concept of, I will give you full information. Madam Speaker, the tradition of using projects to invest in social intervention was shown by all the researchers to have failed. Not on the huge volume of what 300 million spent, and in some small alleged NGOs, because the government fund them, PMI and a number of others, which are small offices, couldn't serve the community. But the project funding that was used along the way, all indications, over 70% of the funds went to parallel staff, consultants, researchers, and very little reached the source of the community where the people are in need of it. It's a fact of research. Fact of research. I didn't say it. The Capri study did. Today, we have moved it into a coordinated approach and establish an effective management, monitoring, and evaluation system. So, funds being directed to the agencies, members are asking. We can give you the data, and we'll do so in due course, but I have to comment tonight. The issue, for example, of the most recent program on the security plan, which dealt with interfacing with parents, interfacing with the hard training program, the hundreds of thousands hard training program was done, focus on zones of special operations. In addition to that, providing psychosocial support. We have already trained over 40 psychosocial aides in communities across critical areas. That is far more than was involved in any of the NGOs you had. it happens that they are concentrated in specific areas and will expand it and scale it up nationally. The Ministry of National Security has taken our social services. We are designing programs, intervening in specific cases, and moving out. You have a case manager in Southwest St. Andrew, and you know her. She operates in Haile Selassie. And that has no difference. Right? Right? And there are several case managers, far more case managers were there before. We have some 30 of them now and will be taking on more this year. The psychosocial aids are crucial to, in fact, dealing with what you refer as the root cause. Until you can find the families and deal with them and deal with the emotional trauma there, you're not going to have any change. Just providing some handouts does not help. Well, that's what you're doing before with that is. Right? Right? That's what was being done. Right? Now, we have trained people. Our case management operation is now being looked at internationally for best practice. And the case manager are designed to, in fact, reach the individuals, identify not only the person involved, but the entire family, and bring to bear the other social services of government, from PATH to training in heart and the other activities that we require to pull them out of poverty and change society. The data will be provided to this House in due course, but that has moved aggressively. You will get it when I think it is necessary to give you. Okay? I have the data. It is monitored by the relevant agencies, including PIOJ and international agencies which are in partnership in funding. We have moved directly into ensuring that the services to the communities are the best. The poor communities deserve the best service. That's just a fact of life. Right? There's reference to, we'll do it. We are following up now with the interministerial program, which we work in collaboration with the Ministry of Education. We're currently in 35 schools, in which we do a comprehensive review of the problem in that school. The case managers are assigned, the psychosocial aides are trained, along with the guidance counselor, to identify the young individuals who are currently challenged and to move them in appropriate services to direct them away from crime and other social behavior. That is providing a model to expand and scale up as we go through. 35 schools. The projects you refer to often weren't even in one school. I had a big office in Montego Bay, one psychiatrist. He was downtown. Nobody went there to them, right? Absolutely nobody. And calling somebody to talk to people about that is not the answer. Your PMI program. There's nothing, right? All the other programs you're talking, right? They're nothing more comprehensive than the current approach to case management and district management under the zones of special operation, the school program, where the school becomes a center of a district. In addition to that, all the areas, you have 7 zones, which is partly the focus, and the other 105 communities which have been identified by the PIOJ areas where we are looking at intervening, and will do so in a systematic manner. Just acquiring a large number of people and putting them on the road is not the answer. In addition to that, we have developed an effective risk assessment tool that's also been accepted now internationally as a best practice tool. We had none of that before. Neither the case managers nor the risk management tool. Those are issues which I bring in details to the House. The risk management tool decides the district to go to objectively. And that we are proceeding along the line. We are working now to provide a data center where you have a commonality of the data acquired to be able to, in real time, evaluate the impact of the work in the community internationally as a best practice tool. We had none of that before. Neither the case managers nor the risk management tool. Those are issues which I bring in details to the House. The risk management tool decides the district to go to objectively. And that we are proceeding along the line. We are working now to provide a data center where you have a commonality of the data acquired to be able to, in real time, evaluate the impact of the work in the communities we are dealing with. We have spent billions of dollars, and crime went up and up and up, despite of those programs referred to by the member from Southeast St. Andrew. It was, during that time, huge sums were being spent on your social intervention programs. Nothing was done to bring crime down. Where we are operating, in the districts we are operating, the impact is showing. I'll bring the data to you, and we'll scale them up. The ministry is not taking over social services. We are coordinating and collaborating to ensure that the relevant agencies, health, social security, education, labor and social security, their funds will be spent appropriately and efficiently, and we will provide the data if we so wish. But there's a comprehensive, holistic approach which is monitored by the highest level, at the highest level of government, the permanent secretaries, etc., to ensure that money goes where it should go, the people who are in need of it get the money, and in the end, we are monitored by the City Security Secretariat. That has been objectively and professionally, and providing the kind of service that was never done before. Right? So, Madam Speaker, I just make a note of it. In due course, you'll get it.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The truth is, this debate didn't start today, and it's going to continue. Yeah. A part of the problem must be, Minister, that it would be helpful if in this whole discussion the evidence such as it is are produced. Because on the one hand, there's a view that it's an experimentation that is being done, when perhaps what is needed, if a new program is being developed, it would naturally need time for certain things to happen. But in the meantime, it would help if what comes along with the discussion is the evidence to support some of the actions that are being taken. The time that is needed for certain things to occur and for certain things to work, new programs, new ideas to germinate and to work, is the time in which persons are wanting to understand exactly what the benefits are and what will be achieved by this new program. When you bring legislation of this kind in the interim to impose punishment on particularly young people, it raises all kinds of concerns, because the warehousing of people become one of the prospects of what people are concerned that is being done. The second chance that most persons get in life, particularly young people, is not given to some of those individuals, and yet we are proceeding at a pace that have implication not just for the individual involved, but for the criminal justice system itself. The whole matter of plea bargain is now interrupted, and so you have to, when you come to close, Minister, you need to explain how that works, right? But the point has been raised that if you now clog the system, we already have a challenge system. You clog the system, then you allow some more hardened criminals, some of them with recidivism rates that are high, to escape because your system is so clogged, while you're putting attention on the young people who should be getting whatever benefit is necessary and certainly supported by the evidence. So it makes the conversation very difficult, because on the one hand you're saying we're doing something, but we need time for it to germinate and for the benefits to be clear. On the other hand, you're acting in ways that are seemingly to heap punishment on particularly young people, and one of the implications of it is that the system gets so clogged that you're not moving on, and you're taking your attention off the hardened criminal. So there are a number of issues there that are real in communities, some of which I represent. We start with a failing school argument. Right? And so you have people who did not benefit from the current education system. And you have the other issues. We talk about the psychosocial. I don't know of one of those in the constituency that are of concern to me. I don't know of one. And I'd love to know. And the minister knows that I've been arguing for other kinds of support and attention in certain of those communities. In the meanwhile, we're waiting for Zozo and some other things to catch up with the problem. So the problem is bigger than Zozo. Way bigger than Zozo. And the impression is being given, Minister, that what the government is doing is heaping punishment on people who whose concerns are real and need to be addressed. That's the impression that is being given. And of course, the age-old issue about taking the judgment from the judges themselves is a problem. So we have problems compounding problems in this particular area. And I urge you to think about it very carefully, because no one is soft on no crime. That's foolish. People are saying we want to get to how do we really solve it? So there's a problem. Everybody agree on that. How we solve it is the points of disagreement, and there's genuine disagreement. And the point is data can help us, certainly help me. That evidence-based and data-driven is what I've been preaching for years. Evidence-based and data-driven. In the absence of that, you wonder if it's just no more experimentation and pressure from the public, or we're just trying to do a thing. We're saying we're acting and we're tough on crime. We're getting tough on young people. And I don't know what the longer-term consequence of that is going to be. So, Minister, I'd like you to really consider this thing. And there shouldn't be no rush to judgment on this. If there's a need to go back and look at the thing and calibrate it, please consider it, because now is the time to do it. Not after we passed it and we see that it is the impact or the unintended consequences other than we intended.
Madam Speaker, I'm not proposing to rehash the debate that has already taken place in the committee that would have reviewed the proposed amendments. But some points have been made which are valid points. Concerns have been raised, particularly by the member from St. Andrew South East, which, like that member, I have communities of similar profile and indeed would raise similar concerns. The member's pointed question is that where do I go if there is a flare-up of gang activity in my constituency? It is a question that members of parliament who have inner city communities, who represent particularly in urban areas, and more so now we are seeing a spread into rural Jamaica, that gang activity, particularly involving young men, is a growing concern. The government has to take a comprehensive approach to treating with the issue of violence, and specifically youth in violence. I want to inform the member that when it comes to gang activity, flare-up in communities, especially if it involves youth, yes, you may need social work intervention. Yes, some of the youngsters are probably misled. Some of the youngsters are probably from broken homes. Some of the youngsters may have been diverted into a life of crime. And it requires clinical, sometimes, intervention, psychological intervention, and for want of a better term, a kind of social support, social work kind of intervention. There are many agencies of government that provide that kind of support. But outside of that, if it is that the member is saying that in his constituency there are young men involved in criminal activity that is causing a flare-up, then the first port of call would be the police, the police community safety branch. And they have well-trained, specialized skills in intervening in these kinds of situations, not only from a policing perspective, but many years ago, the call was we need to invest in community policing. And we have invested significantly, substantially in developing community policing. Hold on, we're coming to all of those, because we have to stand up and dispel the false narratives. We have invested heavily in increasing the capabilities of our police force, in not just to respond in a unidimensional way. That's number one. Once they, and we have seen this all the time, every member inside here, at some point in time, if they have had a gang flare-up, would have been invited by the police commander, come let us have our community group meetings. Come let us have the community walks. I have participated many times, and I'm certain, exactly, member, so have all of you. Then how could you stand up and say that where do you go to? How could you stand up and say that? No, Madam Speaker, the police. Let me address that. So, it is not accurate, and I'm being euphemistic, to say there is nowhere to reach out. The appropriate place where the intervention for criminal activity, youth deviance that is aligned with criminal activity is in the police. That's number one. Outside of that, Madam Speaker, once the police are aware of the nature and profile of the young people, because the member raised the issue in a particular context, is concern for young people, particularly those below 18. That's my recollection of what you said. Now, once the profile of the problem has been established, and they have dealt with the criminal element, and they have established safety, then they move now to the case managers. They have, again, specialized resources in the police force. Again, not unidimensionally focused on just merely policing. The numbers, we must admit, would not be appropriate and sufficient to the magnitude of the problem. But I would say definitively that the numbers are increasing and the investment to support them is increasing. And that is without question. Those case managers, along with other resources, including the justice centers, including support from JSF, all of them come together to focus on the community. Now, if the situation rises to the level, Madam Speaker, where it has been established that the intervention requires more than regular policing, then we would declare a zone of special operations, which we have done, and they have been successful in the communities that have traditionally flared up. And it has worked effectively, without question, Madam Speaker. And that brings together all the state agencies that focus development support in the communities. And I have gone through in my budget presentation and listed all the interventions and the massive budget that has been spent. on community intervention, on youth intervention, and all the interventions, the social interventions. Now, bear in mind, Madam Speaker, bear in mind that outside of the zones of special operations and the efforts of the security forces, the problem of unattached youth is one that one of the greatest methods of intervention for unattached young people. Yes, they need guidance and they need the social work, but you know what? Madam Speaker, member from Southeast, they also need work. Their hands and minds and hearts need to be engaged. And that is why this government stands proudly to say that we have cut significantly, in more than half, youth unemployment in this country. Unattached youth in this country is at the lowest level it has ever been. And we announced recently programs that will pull in our unattached youngsters who have been idle in communities for a long time. Our youngsters have now more opportunity to be integrated into the mainstream of the society and find meaningful employment. This does not say, Madam Speaker, that we still do not have, as every society would have, a problem with youth deviance. Youngsters who are misguided, youngsters who have psychological problems, youngsters who fall in conflict with the law for whatever reason. That is why we have put resources into the CPF-SA. We have enhanced the capacities of both the Justice Center, but more so the Ministry of Education through schools, right? We have made a massive investment, Madam Speaker. One of the most advanced intervention capabilities in the therapeutic center, which we have built at Maxfield, is it Maxfield Park Children's Home. In effect, Madam Speaker, we intend to expand this with at least, I think, plans for 2 others, which bring together all the clinical and psychological interventions necessary to treat with our youngsters in that way. So I want to strongly counteract this narrative that there is no coordinated effort of the government. There is a study, Madam Speaker, done by Capri, and it looked at the government's intervention strategy between 2007 to 2018. It's a 10-year study. And that study concluded, Madam Speaker, that close to 70% of the budget for intervention did not reach to the target who needed it, the young people. So we did, and that is why we mainstream the budget into the agencies that are already paid to deliver those services. And that is why, under this strategy, we are able to have institutional development, as you are seeing with the police. There's no question, no one can question the investment in the institutional development of the police force. That is why you're seeing an expansion in the outreach of the Ministry of Justice in a coordinated and strategic way with the justice centers, with mediation. That is why you're seeing greater output from the Ministry of Education in dealing with our young people, particularly through the CPF-SA. That is why you're seeing interventions being targeted through JSIF with the zones of special operations. So this false notion must be destroyed in the minds of the public. Now, Madam Speaker, there is the argument being preferred, again, another smokescreen. We must bring the evidence. Bring the evidence. Look, when as legislators, we cannot legislate by emotion. Right? We can't just get up one day and say, we don't like this and therefore. We have to look at the problem from an objective way. We have to be objective in our analysis of the problem. Madam Speaker, the notion that somehow we are going to be warehousing people in our jails. Jamaica has the lowest incarceration rate in the region. The lowest incarceration rate. Now let's just establish, the government is not saying that incarceration is the answer. That's not the argument. Hold on. Relative to other jurisdictions of similar profile of Jamaica, and when you compare our sentencing, different business from jails. Now, when you compare our sentencing system, again, Jamaica is not the, we don't have the strongest sentences. There is value, a deterrence value, in a system of penalties that have strong deterrent effect. There's no question about that. And that is why you have this strong and overwhelming call, which I'm certain the member from St. Mary Western is going to again make his plea to this House regarding going to even greater extremes. The truth is that we need to revise our sentencing regime to bring it in line with the magnitude of the problem that we have. Now let's look at the numbers. How many youngsters we have charged for murder over the last, say, 5 years? You have the number? Just remind, what's the number? You have it there? No, I just want to know. You are saying, the truth is, you have the number there? From 2019. So from last year, none. From 2022 onwards. So from 2019 to 2022, we have 79 youngsters. Under 18. Under 18. Under 18. I'm going based on the context of the member from Southeast. 17 and under, yeah. Have been arrested for murder. Yeah. It is a significant number over 3 years for youngsters. Certainly we would want it to be much lower. But I would not say that this represents a crisis situation over 3 years. And I would say that in the last 2 years, the numbers have been actually lower. No, I don't have that data. I'm just saying arrested. Now, I will get you that evidence. I will get you that data. Now, Madam Speaker, we have put in place a commission to study this issue of violence generally, but in particular, this issue of youth violence. And I agree that it is something that you can't use hard policing measures to solve. You have to pay attention to the underpinning social issues. There is no question about that. But at the same time, Madam Speaker, the government must take a comprehensive approach. And our approach, I think, it's far more comprehensive than we have ever had. Far more comprehensive and strategic than we have ever had. These 79 youngsters, which from 2019 to 2022 would have been arrested for murders. I am certain that after the passage of this bill, and they get the understanding of what the consequence of their actions are, in the same way that we are already seeing increased recovery of firearms, but a reduction as well in shootings. In other words, the new Firearms Act, which has adjusted upward the penalties, we are already starting to see the impact of the legislation on the decisions of our young people in relation to firearm crimes. And you're going to see that reverberate right throughout the society. The stiffer penalties, the stronger penalties, the adjusted penalty regimes will have a deterrent effect on crime and criminals in the country. So I urge the members opposite to give credit to the policies of the government and to acknowledge them. And where, Madam Speaker, any of them may be having any challenge in accessing any service, or they don't know of any service, it's a simple matter, Madam Speaker, of just reaching out with a phone call. And you have called me, you can call the minister, to any of us, and we can point you in the right direction. We can point you in the right direction. So, Madam Speaker, I rest my case.
You talk about plenty of things I'm going to ask, and you don't deal with what I ask. Where is the evidence? No. Of the 79, what were their sentences? Find out. And find out if they were light sentences.
No, but it would have been sentenced under the previous.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The debate today on these three bills, which are to do with sentencing policy in legislation, debate has expanded to issues around the effectiveness of the overall approach to the government in trying to tackle the terrible problem Jamaica has with violent crime. The truth of the matter is that those of us who live in or who represent constituencies with communities that have high levels of violent crime, our experience tells us that there is an inadequacy of state response to that problem. That's something we experience week in, week out. There was a time, for example, when the Peace Management Initiative was active in the corporate area in Spanish Town, St. Catherine, and so on, and where one could rely on their trained violence interrupters and their process to come into a community and assist in diffusing conflicts that have arisen and which are threatening to spiral into a series of reprisals, to try and nip that in the bud, so to speak. They have been totally defunded, and they no longer effectively exist. The Violence Prevention Alliance isn't able to play that role. The police, through the Department of the Police that deals with community policing, from time to time, they will have these, what they call widely publicized public meetings in communities where there have been problems. And they bring in other agencies to be there. Sometimes the fire department is there. Sometimes the local inspector will be there. Member of Parliament may be there, and so on. And they, the community gets to be present and questions are asked and so on. But the reality is that those events really have little impact on the gang violence or the kind of high level of conflict in the community among gunmen that is a real problem that needs to be addressed. So the comment that says that the state really hasn't effectively addressed these problems yet is a valid point, and I don't think our experience suggests that we can accept the arguments that have been put forward by the other side today that there are adequate and effective remedies being proposed or rolled out by the government in this regard. Indeed, were it so that the state's responses are fulsome and well-designed and adequate, the private sector wouldn't have to be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on Project STAR to try and make a difference in this very area of life in specific communities. And the Project STAR, initiative is something that we commend the private sector for, and I'm not criticizing them. We have not at all. In fact, we have participated. I've participated in events that they have put on, and I strongly support their initiative. But the point is that it is because of the failure of the state to play that role in an adequate and effective way that the private sector has to be stepping in to fill that breach. That is a reality. That is a reality. And no amount of howling and so on can undermine the reality of that. So getting more specific to the bill now. The bill seeks to impose higher mandatory minimum sentences for the crime of murder. Higher, substantially higher. Now, there have been for a very long time mandatory minimum sentences for the crime of murder. Our crime of murder recognizes murders in certain circumstances set out in law which attract the potential death penalty, or if it is not imposed, sentence for life, life imprisonment, and other categories of murder where life imprisonment can be imposed or a term of imprisonment for a specific number of years. And where a term of imprisonment is imposed, there is a minimum below which the court cannot go. And it is that which is being increased. And it is being increased very substantially from, I think, 20 years to 50 years in the case of capital murder, and from 15 years as a mandatory minimum to, I believe it's 45 years for non-capital murder. Now, that is a decision that this Parliament is taking, and the majority are in favor of it. As I said before, when I think these bills were first tabled, my position on that is, personally, I do not like mandatory minimum sentencing, because as somebody who is a lawyer by training, I believe that it is important in our system of governance, where we have a separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, it is important that the judiciary be unfettered in playing their role of adjudicating justice in the particular case before the court. And that is a fundamental role that they play. So we are here in Parliament making law, and when we impose a mandatory minimum sentence, what we're saying is, regardless of what happens in a particular case, if someone is charged for this offense, the judge has to impose a sentence of at least this minimum amount. And that used to be 15 years for non-capital murder. It could be life, and it was often somewhere in between. Now it is going to be, I believe it's 45, the Joint Select Committee says it's a minimum of 45 years or up to life. And for capital murder, a minimum of 50 years or up to life. Then there's the whole issue of parole. Now, parole is not a right. Parole is something that's granted at the discretion of the parole board and cannot be applied for before a certain portion of your sentence has been served. What the legislation also seeks to do is to say that you are not eligible for parole. You can't apply for parole until you've served a much longer period of time, whether it be for capital or non-capital murder. The effect of this is going to be that the prison population, unless crime, the rates of crime in this country substantially change from where they have been, you're going to have a growing prison population because the duration of the sentences is going to be much longer. We already have heavily overcrowded prisons, especially maximum security prisons. Overcrowded prisons. Our prisons are old. The two main prisons that we have, Tower Street Correctional Facility, better known as GP, and St. Catherine District Prison, are both very old facilities. They are they have serious structural problems, and they are heavily overcrowded. And that situation is going to be worsened by these very high, long mandatory minimum sentences. It also has the effect, apart from the justice side of it, which I've expressed my concern about, which is that it takes away the ability of the judge to look at the facts of the particular case, the circumstances of the case, and impose a sentence that that judge feels is appropriate. That is being, to some extent, curtailed and restricted because there's a floor imposed by Parliament below which the judge cannot go. And it's a very high floor under this legislation. Very high floor. But apart from that, the impact of these very high mandatory minimum sentences on accused persons is that they are going to be, and are already, increasingly reluctant to plead guilty on the basis that the court can award a discount to them that would make sense for them to accept their responsibility for what they did and go and serve time at the discounted amount that the court has imposed. Rather, the incentive is go to trial, take your chances, and depending on how serious a criminal it is, there are other problems in terms of obstruction of justice, which the system has to contend with, where people are going to trial, interference with witnesses, etc., etc. So there are real downside risks for Parliament to be imposing a regime of very high mandatory minimum sentences. We've done it for firearms, and we've seen already in the court system what is happening in terms of the buildup of cases there in the gun court and circuit courts. And we are now doing it for murder. So these are some of the policy decisions that the government has taken, which have, I think, significant downside risks that we ought to really reflect on in making these decisions. I'm going to turn to the actual provisions in the bill, because I must say I have some concerns. In the amendment to the Child Care and Protection Act, the bill that amends the Child Care and Protection Act seeks to repeal Section 78 of the existing Act and put a new Section 78 in place. And that new Section 78, subsection 3A1, in relation to a capital offense, says that a person who is an adult at sentencing, but who was a child at the time that the offense was committed, is subject to a penalty of 50 years imprisonment. That's the minimum. And the court may specify that the child is not eligible for parole before serving 20 years. So what this does is that it treats a person who offended when they were a child as subject to the same minimum penalty of 50 years imprisonment as a person who committed that offense as an adult. Now, this runs against what is now, I think, internationally accepted policy, that children, when they come into conflict with the law, are to be treated by the court system in a more sympathetic way than how adults are. And the reason for that, of course, is because the kind of issues that children and adolescents in particular are grappling with, and the bad choices that children make because their cognitive skills are not fully developed until they're adults, means that imposing very harsh mandatory minimum sentences is unfair and unwise as a response to how you deal with a child. The new section 78.3A3 applies to an offender who is a child who has attained the age of 14 years. And it says that that child who has achieved or attained the age of 14 years is subject to, and commits a murder, is subject to a minimum penalty of 50 years imprisonment. And the court may specify that the child is not eligible for parole before serving 20 years. So, it's applying the same regime to a child who is before the court and being sentenced, who is between the ages of 14 and 17 years old, and who may have committed that offense when they were under 14 years. It says, read the provision. It says that when they are before the court as a child who has attained the age of 14, this is a regime that should apply to them. But when they committed the offense, they may have been under the age of 14. That is what it says. That is what it says. Look at it. It may be that there's an ambiguity in the wording of the provision, but it can be read in that way. And I think that's a problem. So the new section 78.3A2 applies where the offense is capital murder and the offense is and the offender is under the age of 14. So this is another limb of this now, where the offender is under the age of 14. And I assume that means at the time they're being sentenced. On the other hand, the new section 78.4 applies where the child under the age of 14 commits an offense specified in the fourth schedule. But the fourth schedule includes murder. So you have two parallel tracks dealing with children who are under 14 when they commit murder. You have one under 78.4, and you have one under 78.3A Roman 2. How those two operate at the same time is unclear to me. And I think that's problematic. The new section 78.5 applies where a child of 14 or more years is convicted of non-capital murder. And it says that a child is subject to a minimum penalty of 30 years imprisonment. And the court may specify that the child is not eligible for parole before serving 15 years. Again, this can be read as applying even if the child who is being sentenced was less than 14 years when the offense was committed, because it's speaking in the present tense to the child before the court who is being sentenced and has attained 14 or more years. But what about their age when they committed the offense? That must be brought into account. So in my view, these provisions in the new Section 78 of the Child Care and Protection Act, as amended by this bill, are arguably incompatible with the right of every child to such measures of protection as are required by virtue of the status of being a minor or as part of the family, society, and state, which Section 13(3)(k) of the Constitution guarantees, and is therefore arguably unconstitutional. I'm concerned that the new Section 78 violates the Constitution. And I'm saying it here because we are sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution, and I do not like to pass legislation which may be unconstitutional. And our children are given rights under the Constitution to measures of protection as are required by virtue of being a minor. Furthermore, to impose these long mandatory minimum sentences on persons who offend when they are children, and possibly even offend when they are less than 14 years old, is really excessive. 50 years is a very, very long time. 30 years for non-capital murder for a child offender. And it is not in keeping with the spirit and intent of the Child Care and Protection Act. The Child Care and Protection Act was really there to ensure that children are appropriately dealt with when they come into conflict with the law and how the justice system deals with them. And this, I think, is really inconsistent with the spirit and intent of the Child Care and Protection Act, and indeed with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And UNICEF, who is one of our international development partners, specializing, of course, in children, matters related to children, have written of their tremendous concern with this aspect of the legislation. So I'm really asking the Minister of Justice to look again at Section 78 and the amendments, the new Section 78 that this is seeking to impose. I am not aware that there is a sense that persons who commit offenses as children are being sentenced in too lenient a way. I've not heard anybody say that before. I've seen no evidence to suggest it. So I'm really not sure what's behind this. But we're really bringing in some extreme provisions here in relation to how we deal with children who have fallen afoul of the law in a very, they've fallen afoul of the law in a very serious way, and the law must respond appropriately. But mandatory minimum sentencing for children doesn't allow the court to look at the circumstances of that child, look at the circumstances in which the offense was committed, and to fashion an appropriate penalty and supporting regime to enable that child to hopefully be rehabilitated, which is really what ought to happen. If you're sentenced for 50 years minimum, what chance of rehabilitation is there? You know, it's... The other point I want to make, Minister, Madam Speaker, relates to the amendment to the Criminal Justice Administration Act. And it's dealing with the regime of discounts that are available if you plead guilty. And where somebody is pleading guilty to an offense which would attract a life sentence, for the purpose of working out what the discount would be and what the sentence should be that is imposed, you have to deem that offense to be subject to a certain number of years. And what the legislation is saying here in the new 42F as amended is 50 years. 50. And I'm glad you said that, Minister, because my recommendation is that should be 45 years. And let me tell you why. Because the effect of it, if you plead guilty at the earliest opportunity that you can, which is what we want to encourage people to do if they're guilty, the 1/3 discount that is available would take you to, if it's a 45-year deemed thing, would take you to 30 years, which is the minimum sentence for non-capital murder. So it would be a coherent system. If it's at 50, a 1/3 of 50 is actually higher than the minimum. So you're incentivizing them to go to trial rather than incentivizing them to plead guilty. So if you put the deemed number of years that's applicable or is treated as being equivalent to a life sentence at 45 rather than 50, you have a coherent system.
Assist the leader of the opposition and colleagues. I'm not closing today, but I want to just we have not in this legislation excluded the plea bargaining act. Right. And one of the good things about high sentence, which I will explain when I close, it might encourage most of them to plead guilty, which is what happened in the United States. You're with me? In other words, we may not be imposing the criminal administration that, discount. But once they plead guilty, they're in a position to engage in plea bargaining. So it could be in the sentence once it is agreed with the judge.
Thank you, Minister. And I understand that point. I'm just simply saying, since you are amending Section 42F, if you chose 45 years rather than 50, the effect of it would be that the incentive would still be to plead guilty rather than to take a chance at trial. Well, those provisions are still going to be in the law, so we may as well make them coherent. So, Madam Speaker, I have real concerns about the treatment of Section 78 of the Child Care and Protection Act. I understand the desire in sentencing persons who commit offenses as adults, especially the offense of murder, capital and non-capital, that the government wants to send a signal by imposing much higher mandatory minimum sentences than existed before. I understand that sentiment. The hope is that it will have a deterrent effect. That remains to be seen. I want to bring to Parliament's attention the downside risks of that approach, which are much heavier problems of overcrowding in the prisons, greater pressure on the prison population. Chances are that there will be greater burdens of courts of cases in the criminal justice system, because persons are facing high mandatory minimum sentences and therefore are less inclined to plead guilty and more inclined to take their chances with trial in an environment where we know that witness intimidation and worse is a real problem, and even jury interference is a problem. So we're putting much greater stresses on the system, the criminal justice system, both in trial process and in the correctional facilities when we take this approach. And I wanted to mention it in Parliament because I mentioned it in the context of the firearms legislation, only to hear from the Minister of National Security, I think in December, that amendments are being brought, which we haven't seen yet, because of the very issues I raised then. And the other thing I wanted to put on record was my own concern about an approach, not so much in the context of murder, because we've always had mandatory minimum sentences, although the levels are being doubled or thereabouts. But we've seen it in the context of firearms. I don't know what else the government is going to come with. Essentially, we're seeing a trend of taking away of judicial discretion over sentencing and giving Parliament a say rather than the judges a say. And that is not the way our system is supposed to operate. And I'm not aware of any evidence that suggests that our judges are not sentencing appropriately. They can sentence up to life, and they often give very heavy sentences. So the claim is being made. The claim is being made, but the Prime Minister didn't have the data on the sentencing patterns for those children. He had data on how many children had been charged between 2019 and 2022, but the sentencing aspect of it, we didn't have that data. So I'm just saying that from my perspective, this is a trend that I'm seeing, and it is a trend which goes against the normal, well-established principles of separation of powers and the very important role that judges have to play, which is to ensure that they do justice in the case before them. The victims are there, and the victims and the families of the victims must have a say and must be able to, and they are able to give a statement so that the court has their views to take into account. But the range of circumstances in which people offend varies widely. A former criminal lawyer, once upon a time a distinguished criminal lawyer before he started to do all this conveyancing and so on. You know that, Minister. You know that. You know, it's a vicious serial killer is at one end. And then you have at the other end a youngster who gets into bad company and has no prior record and gets into a situation and does something stupid and somebody is killed by it. And you can't treat them in the same way. You can't, because they're not the same circumstances. One can be rehabilitated, and even forgiveness, you may not forget, but forgiveness is an important part of the healing of victims and their families as well. And, you know, they want to see an appropriate sentence. But, the consciousness of our people can be elevated to the level where people get closure from having seen the justice done. And justice includes a proportionate response to what took place. Proportionality is vital. So, Madam Speaker, those are my submissions. I hope that the Minister will have another look at the new Section 78 very carefully, in the context of the right of the child under the Constitution that I mentioned here, and the international treatment and requirements of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that Jamaica is a signatory to, and which indeed led to the Child Care and Protection Act being enacted. I wouldn't want to see us go down a route that we later have to backtrack on and wheel and come again. I thank you, Madam Speaker.